There have been many times throughout the history of Catholic theology where absolutely great arguments get lost. The strongest, best defended arguments refuting heresy and vindicating the Catholic faith have far too often been left in old books that don't get read anymore. Worse yet, sometimes only caricatures and remnants of these strong arguments are passed down to contemporary theologians and apologists, taking away from the eminent credibility that Catholic theology should always possess before all men. The case is not at all different when it comes to Sola Scriptura. In ages past, we gave arguments that were rigorously demonstrative and refuted the very foundation of this Protestant heresy. But unfortunately, this argument has been replaced with what amounts to a rhetorical trap.
First, we need to begin by defining our terms. What do Protestants intend to communicate when they affirm Sola Scriptura? For them, Sola Scriptura means that the only infallible rule of faith and the supreme judge of all controversies is Scripture alone. Thus, the Leiden synopsis. This Scripture alone is the principle from which, and the substance from which, all saving truth is to be deduced, the canon and norm by which every true, and so every false doctrine of things divine, must be measured." End quote. This video is not meant to directly attack Sola Scriptura, but a more fundamental doctrine upon which Sola Scriptura is based, that is, the sufficiency of Scripture. It is important to realize that the relationship between Sola Scriptura and the sufficiency of Scripture is non-reciprocal. This means that Sola Scriptura depends on the sufficiency of Scripture, but the sufficiency of Scripture does not depend on Sola Scriptura. In order to understand why this is the case, we need to understand how Protestants define the sufficiency of Scripture. They define the sufficiency of Scripture as the doctrine that all things that have been publicly revealed for the Church is contained either expressly or implicitly in Scripture. Thus, Leonardus Ricenius states, "The question is not as to all traditions. Historical and ritual traditions are given, also divine and apostolic ones, that is, dogmas handed down by Christ and the apostles. The question is as to dogmatic and ethical traditions, whether such are given over and above Scripture, which we deny." End quote. So obviously, if Scripture doesn't contain all public revelation for the Church, either implicitly or explicitly, then obviously Scripture cannot be adequate for the task of being the sole infallible rule of faith and supreme judge of all controversies. On the other hand, even if I were to concede that Scripture is sufficient for such, it is not impossible for there to be another infallible rule of faith. Thus, if the sufficiency of Scripture is refuted, so also is Sola Scriptura. Further, it is also important to realize that Catholics do not deny all forms of the sufficiency of Scripture. I go over this in much more detail in another video. For example, the great saint and doctor of the Church, St. Augustine of Hippo, writes in his work De Doctrina Christiana that, quote, "Those matters that are plainly laid down in the Scriptures, whether rules of life or rules of faith, are to be searched into more carefully and more diligently, and the more of these a man discovers, the more capacious does his understanding become. For among the things that are plainly laid down in Scripture are to be found all matters that concern faith and the manner of life, to wit, hope and love, of which I have spoken in the previous book." End quote. If you look into the previous book that St. Augustine mentions, it becomes clear that he simply meant to say that those essential matters that are necessary for bringing about the virtue of faith and the virtues of charity and hope are found plainly in Scripture. This is a much less audacious claim than the Protestant makes, and is conceded by the Roman Catholic not only for the entirety of Scripture, but even for parts of Scripture, such as the individual Gospels. Catholics will go so far as to say that this is even true for the Creed and the Ten Commandments.
So when it comes to the Protestant version of the sufficiency of Scripture, upon which the Protestant doctrine of Sola Scriptura is based, is it coherent? From a consideration of the issue of the inspiration of the books of the Bible, I think any reasonable person would have to say no. To understand this, we need to understand a distinction between what is naturally knowable and what is above nature. Those things that are naturally knowable are proportioned to our intellects, and we can reach them by our natural powers. Thus, by the natural powers of our intellect, we can reach the fact that God exists. On the other hand, there are certain things that are above nature and cannot be known by our natural powers. These are called supernatural truths. When it comes to these, we cannot use our minds to reason up to them. but they need to come down to us by divine revelation, and divine revelation happens through the public witness of the prophets and the apostles. Thus St. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 2, "The things also that are of God no man knoweth, but the Spirit of God. Now we have received not the spirit of this world, but the Spirit that is of God, that we may know the things that are given us from God. Which things also we speak, not in the learned words of human wisdom, but in the doctrine of the Spirit." We can call this proposition of truth from God the objective aspect. As an analogy, the objective aspect of receiving supernatural truth is like the words of the teacher being presented to the student. On the other hand, not only must these supernatural truths be presented to us from the apostles and prophets who are inspired by God, but we must also be strengthened and elevated to be able to understand these truths, since they are beyond the powers of our intellect. This comes by the light of faith. Thus, St. Paul writes in the same chapter, "The sensual man perceiveth not these things that are of the Spirit of God, for it is foolishness to him, and he cannot understand, because it is spiritually examined. But the spiritual man judgeth all things, and he himself is judged of no man. For who hath known the mind of the Lord, that we may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." We call this strengthening of our minds the subjective aspect. As an analogy, the subjective aspect of receiving supernatural truth is like the natural light of reason that we have, which is able to understand what our teacher presents to us. Therefore, both the presentation of the teaching, the objective aspect, which is divine revelation, and the strengthening of our intellects, the subjective aspect, which is the light of faith, are necessary in order to know any supernatural truth. If we are not strengthened by God, no matter how much God presents the supernatural truth to us, we cannot grasp it. Further, if God does not let us know the truth, it doesn't matter how much we are strengthened, we are not going to somehow discover it. As a side note, if you want to help support me, consider buying my new released merchandise, which is based on St. Thomas Aquinas. Thank you for any support.
Now let's apply this to the case at hand, the fact that a certain book of the Bible has been inspired. Is the inspiration of an apostle something that is a natural fact or a supernatural fact? Clearly it is something that is supernatural. Inspiration isn't something that you can taste or touch. It isn't something that you can see. Inspiration is something that happens by the extraordinary working of God within the mind of the prophet. Further, simply by picking up a book and reading it, you cannot determine that it is something that is inspired or not. Rather, just like any other supernatural fact, the inspiration of books must be revealed to us. One of the greatest theologians of the 19th century, Cardinal Johann Baptist Franzlin, comments that, quote, "Inspiration is a supernatural psychological fact in the mind of a man, which, like other internal facts, immediately known to God, is known only to the inspired person. The external effect of inspiration is none other than the writing itself and the written book, yet there is no inherent mark in it, which of itself manifests the inspiration as a necessary cause. Therefore the fact of inspiration cannot be known to others except by testimony worthy of faith." End quote. If we are to know that 1 John is an inspired book, then the fact that 1 John is inspired needs to be told to us, or else it is the type of fact that cannot be known. There needs to be the objective proposition of this truth. Now, this basically leaves us with three options. First, it is revealed in Scripture. Second, it is revealed to each person individually. Third, it is revealed in sacred tradition. The first option is obviously not true, since Scripture does not explicitly or implicitly talk about the inspiration of quite a few books of the Bible. For example, where does Scripture explicitly talk about the inspiration of Esther or 3 John? The second option is possible, but absurd when we consider that this simply doesn't happen. The third option is the correct option, and accepted by the Catholic Church. The fact that certain books are inspired was publicly revealed by either a prophet or apostle, and then handed down. Yet, the problem with this is the fact that this contradicts the sufficiency of Scripture outlined above. Yet, Protestants will have 5 proposed solutions to this problem. First, some of them will claim that the total number of inspired books is actually found explicitly in Scripture, such as David Pareus, an early 17th century Reformed scholastic. This is obviously absurd. Ordinarily, they will point to texts like, all scripture is God-breathed. Now, most people are able to see that this is insufficient, since it does not tell you which books are God-breathed, but only that it is a quality of scripture that it be God-breathed. For example, if I said that all my children are descended from me, I would be telling you a certain quality of my children, not enumerating my children individually. Second, some of them, in connection with the last point, will justify this by arguing that everything that a prophet or apostle writes is scripture. Thus, if a prophet or apostle wrote a certain book, it is implied in divine revelation that it is scripture. This is insufficient for two reasons. First, it is not true that everything that an apostle or prophet writes is scripture. An apostle could write a homily, or a private letter, or a grocery list, and it wouldn't somehow necessarily be inspired. Second, it is not true that each book in its text implies authorship from an apostle or prophet. This is the case for books like Esther or every one of the synoptics. For the title of the synoptics is not included in the inspired text any more than the chapter and verse numbers are. Although, as an aside, while it is conceded that there are certain criteria of canonicity, which include certain attributes that canonical books share in all or most cases, the question at hand is not about these criteria, but about what definitively leads us to know whether the book is canonical or not. Third, some will point to ecclesiastical authority to solve the problem. Yet this does not solve the issue either. For how did the church come to know about the canon? Was it through receiving divine revelation? If that's the case, then our position is verified. Was it through the discernment of natural means? This is impossible, as was stated above, due to the nature of inspiration. As to the second point, we do have a position for the church, but this presupposes that it is revealed. Fourth, some point to certain interior attributes of the text, such as its loftiness or good spiritual effects. Yet with both of these, the qualities present are also present in other texts, and therefore, while they are criteria, they cannot be a definitive criterion, just as we said above with the apostolic office. Lastly, some will point to verses like, "My sheep hear my voice," arguing that this implies that true believers are able to hear and discern which books are true and canonical and which are not. Putting aside the fact that this simply doesn't happen, we can also see that this is impossible, for either this text is referring to some sort of subjective strengthening on our part, or it is referring to the discernment of some sort of quality in the text. If the first, then we know from above that correlative to the subjective strengthening is the objective proposition of the fact assented to. So this still doesn't solve the problem at hand. If the second, then it is impossible, for there is nothing unique about the produced text to where we would be able to have some sort of sense that we could pick up on its inspiration, since the effect, that is the text, does not necessitate a spiritual cause, as Frangelin demonstrated above.
Therefore, Protestants have no ability to utilize Sola Scriptura without affirming the very canon of Scripture, which is made known only through the Catholic Church that Christ established. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help support the channel, consider becoming a channel member. As always, God bless.